guys, I'm Amy here tonight with my husband, Christopher. He is a writer and he watches a lot more movies than I do. But for this video, I wanted to talk about book-to-movie adaptations, why those movie adaptations might be different in both good and bad ways, and I figure he's going to be a lot better at talking about that than I am. But what are some of the differences, and why do you think those differences exist?
Well, it's been a little bit since I've had discussions about text to film and film to text and all that. So one of the biggest differences, and probably one of the biggest issues with translation from text to film, is that text is dynamic, whereas film is more static. And so it becomes an issue in interpretation or translation in general. Every person is going to have a different experience, an individual experience in reading a novel. And so the experience that you might have reading a novel, the perception that you might have of certain scenes and character actions and the atmosphere and the backgrounds and everything else may be vastly different from how I interpret any scene or chapter or anything at all, themes in a book.
So
Books are very dynamic in that regard because they don't have a whole lot of information on, say, everything around you and on the screen.
I was going to ask what you meant by static and dynamic, because when I think of a book, I think like the words don't really change much unless you're translating to another language. But I guess when I think about it, like, I have an idea in my mind of what Harry Potter looks like because of the movies. Is that kind of what you're saying?
The words are presenting you an opportunity to create your own imagination, your own images, your own thoughts about what is going on. On film, it is static because they have a background, they have a set design, they have actors that are playing these characters that never change. You and I will watch the same movie, and that movie will always be what that movie is: the sound, the atmosphere, the mannerisms of the characters, the way they move. It doesn't change from person to person. It is going to be what it is.
That's something else that I've thought a little bit about whenever I'm like reading a book, particularly first person perspective. You're in someone's mind, like they're having thoughts about their past and how they got to where they are and how that's changing an interaction with another character, whereas in a movie, I feel like sometimes you kind of have to force that. Like maybe the character in the movie talks to themselves out loud a lot, or maybe you'll have to merge some characters or input an extra scene in order to show the thoughts that the character has in the book, because you don't really read someone's thoughts in a movie unless you do a voiceover, which normally you're not going to do a voiceover for like an entire film.
Yeah, internal voice, that's certainly something that's difficult to translate to film effectively and not, overwhelm everything else. You'll see where we want to try and get some inner dialogue on film, and it usually is some voiceover or narration or something, and they're typically, as you mentioned, it's certainly not going to be an entire movie length.
I can imagine watching a whole movie in voiceover.
But some things just work on paper that just won't work on the screen, and some novels are more enjoyable to people because of the way that they're written. Some people maybe don't enjoy the story so much as they really enjoy the prose, the way that the story is written or put together is what is bringing on that enjoyment. And certain books just will not translate to film because of that
I'm
enjoyment.
also thinking Practical Magic is a pretty well-known book-to-movie adaptation where the movie is really, really beloved. I've read the book and I enjoy the other books in the series so far. I still have to read the fourth book in the series. But the first book definitely wasn't my favorite. I think because of the prose, it came off as a little more literary fiction, a little more sleepy. It just wasn't as interesting as the movie. So, like, what do you think of this idea that the book is always better? Because for a while now, I've heavily disagreed with the idea that the book is always better. There are some cases where the book is certainly better, but I don't think that's always true.
I think the film Forrest Gump has proven that film can be better than text.
Did you read the book?
Yeah, it's been a long time.
But you read the book. I never read the book. I didn't have the heart to do it because I loved the movie so much.
That, I think, is where the time constraints of film certainly had much more benefit over what the novel had, and it's
Is there more to the novel?
There's much more, which is what I think makes it such a poorer story in comparison.
I remember the book being really small.
Well, that may be it. Again, it's been a long time since I've read it, but there's just a lot of goofy nonsense that happens that just becomes more and more fantastical and it loses a lot of the heart that the film, I think, is able to carry.
Did you ever read the second book?
No.
Because apparently the second book came out of the author's hatred of the film for the first book. Something else that I think would be important to talk about, like Firestarter. Did you ever read Firestarter?
I did not.
Okay, so I recently did a buddy read of this with friends, trying not to get the light to bounce off of it. And you said I haven't seen the new movie, but I watched the Drew Barrymore version and really enjoyed it. Thought I would try the book. I finished the book. I can say that much. I did not enjoy the book. This book ended up being so slow. We would have an entire chapter following the father and the daughter. So the father is part of this experiment with his wife. His wife ends up dying at some point, and the daughter that he's raising has pyrokinesis as a result of the trials that he and his wife had been in, and so they're on the run from these members of some kind of government, I guess you would say, but you'll have a whole chapter following the father and the daughter, and then a whole chapter about the pursuers of the father and the daughter. And I feel like it would have been faster and more dynamic and more interesting to have just like a paragraph or two at the end of each chapter with the people following them. And I understand that Stephen King loves his character building, but this book could have been half the size and been a lot more entertaining. But that said, I thought the movie was really, really well done. And it's interesting how pacing changes so much with that.
Yeah, I guess I would agree there. As far as Stephen King goes, he does spend a lot of time developing characters, their relationships with each other, and even side characters seem to come to life in a lot of his stories. He is great at the art of storytelling, specifically in the context of character development, and that's difficult also on screen, to provide that much time to characters you may only see in one or two scenes, to provide that type of context or that background for the character. Again, it's the limitations of the time constraints that a film would have.
And I think that's something to think about too, is that I know this isn't the same for a lot of people, because a lot of people love to read really big books. I don't generally love reading really big books, but also even with a 300-page book, it might take me a couple of days to read that. It might take me a couple of weeks or a couple of months, kind of depending on the author and the pacing and the story. But a movie, even the longest movie, won't take you more than 3 or 4 hours tops. I feel like a book has to be more careful with its pacing almost, because it is going to take someone a longer time to get through it, I guess. Another topic, the Stepford Wives. Did you ever watch either of the more well-known adaptations of this as a movie?
I believe in maybe middle school.
Did you watch the 70s version or did you watch the Nicole Kidman version?
Couldn't tell you.
Because you think that all the women look the same. I have watched both the 1970s version and the 2000s version, so I'm going to spoil this a little bit to give you context for the discussion. In the Stepford Wives, you have, I believe her name is Joanna. Yeah, Joanna and her family moved to Stepford. And it seems like this perfect, cute little place, a great fresh start for their family. But she notices that the women are acting really weird. They're very conscious of their husbands' needs. They put their husbands and their family as not only the number one priority, but the only priority. And they're always perfectly dressed in their 1950s styles. The houses are always super clean. The men get all of the sex that they want. And towards the end of the book, you learn that the guy who's kind of behind it all used to work for Disney. And it's not totally clear in the book if the women are being killed and replaced with robots or being microchipped somehow. But the 1970s film freaked me out when I first watched it, because I wasn't actually really able to get through the book at that time. It wasn't something that was really in my interest, so I watched the movie before I fully read the book. But the movie really stuck to the book and the ideas presented and the characters presented, and it did it really well. But in the 2000s version with Glenn Close plays the woman behind the man behind Stepford. And the wives at the end were able to get revenge on their husbands for the way they'd been treated, but ultimately it's a woman who's behind the whole thing. And to me, that just kind of destroys the point of the book, because I feel like the point of the book, or one of the many points of the book, is patriarchy and its treatment of women and how screwed up that 1950s ideal can be. Whereas in the 2000s, it's like, it was a woman all along. And then it's like, well, where's the patriarchy conversation in that? Are there any book to movie adaptations that stand out to you as having a different ending? And if not, why do you think that sometimes a movie or even a TV show does choose a different ending?
Yeah, so there are adaptations, there are retellings. Some people want to be truer to text, and some people cannot for different reasons. We're looking at Stephen King. A lot of his endings have been changed in his books.
The Mist, which I hated because it was an emotional upheaval.
Yeah, The Mist. The Shining was a big one that Stephen King had some disagreements with. We have, I think Harry Potter also had differences in its ending.
Not so much in the ending, but because of the length of the series, there were a lot of stories and characters that just never show up.
Yeah. So again, there's this concerns and what does and does not translate to film, what will and will not work for a broad audience. A lot of money goes into creating a film. And with that, they have to ensure that it is going to be consumed by a large enough audience that it will gain its money back.
So, do you think that kind of money-making idea could maybe be a little bit of what was behind the Dracula movie? So, he recently finally had me watch a Dracula movie, because as much as I love the book, I'd never seen one of the Dracula movies. And we watched Bram Stoker's Dracula, the one with Winona Ryder. There was some lesbianism. There was a lot of romance between Mina Harker and Dracula that wasn't in the book, and in some ways, I thought it was really well done and a great interpretation of the book, and in other ways, such as the lesbianism and the romance between Dracula and Mina Harker, I'm like, this doesn't need to be here. But do you think that romance was included for money reasons? Because I feel like romance can kind of sell an audience or keep an audience entertained. All of the women, I mean, the women in the book are sexualized, but the women in the movie seemed more so with the costuming and the colors and their actions.
That's possible. I don't know how it was marketed. It came out pretty early in the 90s. So
you were around in the early 90s.
Yeah. And infant me simply cannot recall what the hype was around the movie or the marketing schemes or anything like that at all.
Infant you should have paid more attention.
For sure. But it's possible they felt that it would be an easier story to sell on screen, one that is focused more on some type of romance and drama versus either straight horror or something else. Now, the book itself, I don't think today or even in the early 90s it would have been a story that would have sold as well. Currently, I think as in its time.
I think about that a lot with Lord of the Rings, how I can't stand the books. I think they're really boring. I think they're way too descriptive. And I know that's one way I have to think a lot of the time, where not as many people had money to travel. And it's not that books are cheap, but they're a lot less expensive than traveling. And we didn't have the information and the internet and TV and all of this other technology that's allowed us to travel even from our own homes.
There was also a lot of aspects of that story I don't believe that were cohesive enough that they could be well strung together over the course of 90 or 120 minutes.
How do you mean? Did you finish the book?
You had mentioned a lot.
I finished the book. I don't think you finished the book.
Yeah, I did not. You mentioned a lot of those changes, some that you really enjoyed, specifically Renfield, that you felt made some very good logical changes from text to film.
Renfield is very confusing to me in the book. He's not ever really thoroughly explained, but in the movie, he is the previous lawyer for Dracula that Jonathan Harker ends up taking over for, and I really loved that integration of it. I thought that was really well done and helped make Renfield make more sense to me personally.
Yeah, and those types of changes can really help an audience feel more invested in the story, or at least have a better understanding of it.
Awesome. Any other thoughts on book-to-movie adaptations that you want to share with the camera?
Well, I suppose more a question for you. Are there books that you feel would be simply unable to adapt? Is there anything that you feel just is an entirely unadaptable film? I mean, I'd love to see comments on that for sure, if you all have any comments to add. Just maybe why, or at least just putting the title of the book, but maybe why it could never be adapted to screen.
Off the top of my head, what I've been thinking about is The Gunslinger, which I am not a gunslinger person, not my book. Like, I think I read the first 3. I don't know that I ever finished the 4th one. He loves The Gunslinger. But even in not finishing the series, I can appreciate how hard that would be. There's so many parallel universes. It's been a while since I've read it, and you're going to speak better to that than I will. But something like The Gunslinger, with the magic that goes into it and the world building that goes into it, maybe if you did a TV series with like 20 seasons, maybe you could get through a lot of the material. Maybe the 5th season series by N.K. Jemisin. It's magic that's really focused on earthquakes, on movement of the earth, on relationships and discrimination, and I feel like that style of magic would be really hard to get across well on screen. Yeah, those are probably the 2 big ones that stick out right now.
For sure, I would agree with you on the Dark Tower series. They tried to make that film.
They did a movie just a couple years ago.
The
Did
Gunslinger.
you ever watch that? What was it, Idris Elba?
Yeah, but I never watched it, and
I didn't hear
from what
great
I hear
things.
from the community, it's best not to watch it.
It didn't get a continuation, so that's something.
For sure. Yeah, there are certainly some But some films have shown again that source material can be translated in a manner that makes sense.
Which is
on
something
screen.
that I don't think I have a true appreciation for. More recently, I've really started to think about the literal translation of novels. Like Agustina Bazterrica's Tender is the Flesh was written in Spanish first. Or, no, not Spanish, Portuguese. They would speak Portuguese in Argentina?
No, Spanish.
They do speak.
Brazil is Portuguese.
Brazil's Portuguese. So she's from Agustina Bazterrica is from Argentina. So many words. Speaks Spanish. So the book was translated from Spanish to English. He did not enjoy it. He thought part of it might have been the translation. I really enjoyed it. But also particularly Japanese novels tend for me to not be very well translated. But I never think of the translation from book to movie as being on that same level or as difficult. But even just in this conversation, I'm like, yeah, I've been missing a lot in that translation, just from one medium to another. Like the idea of a picture being worth 1,000 words. I think of it more literally as actual pictures that you would hang on the wall, but that would apply to movies too. I think something else that actually I just thought about is the unfortunate series of events. So we watched the TV show together with Neil Patrick Harris. I thought it was brilliantly done. Each kind of season had its focus where it went from like the story that was presented from one book to the next. Whereas you have the Jim Carrey one of, what was that, the early 2000s, where they did that thing that was really popular, I think, in movies of the time, where it took, I believe, the first 3 books and mashed them together into an hour-and-a-half movie. And I do love that we have limited TV series that are a thing now that weren't really a thing of the past. So you have Handmaid's Tale, the TV show, which takes a single book and stretches it into all of these seasons. I can't really speak to that because the show is too dark for me. You have movie adaptations of things, but then you have these limited series where they'll make a TV show, but you know it's only going to last 2 seasons or 3 seasons, and it's just enough time to really get that extended telling of the story and include all the things that they want to include, and they're not limited like with a movie, and they're not pulling things out of their ass like with what happens with a lot of TV shows, I think. There's one, I believe it was called The Sinner, or it might just be the first season that was called The Sinner, but I thought the whole thing was called The Sinner. It's got to be like 3 or 4 seasons now, but it takes this author's set of books, and the first season was one book of a murder mystery, and then the second season was another book that they wrote that was a murder mystery. And I think that's really interesting how they've been able to do that.
Yeah. One of the other things you're going to have to look at is how well things can or cannot translate from one medium and screen to another. Say animation to live action, and we see it. We've seen it recently with Netflix doing Death Note and this One Piece recently, which is well received.
What was the single season show that we watched?
Cowboy Bebop?
Yes. Was that a book or was that an anime? That was an animated show.
Yeah, from the 90s.
And you really liked that. Why do you think that didn't get the continuation? Maybe that's a big question.
Yeah, so there's a lot to go on with that, but well, maybe for another episode.
Okay.
At least for now, I think if we could hear maybe in the comments any books that you are wanting to see adapted to film.
Yes.
For sure, and any books you feel could never be adapted to film.
That would be a good question for the comments. What is a book that you hope would never get adapted to film? Because there are some books that I think maybe a lot of the integrity of the novel or a lot of the storytelling could just be ruined by a movie. Also, it's very end of the video, but I'm also thinking of, I know Gavin from How to Train Your Gavin has read like the Sabrina the Teenage Witch series, so there was the shows, the show with what's her name, the blonde that came out. Sorry, my mind is dead at this time of night. And they ended up releasing a whole series of books, and it's like, or you might have a movie that comes out, usually more of a kid's movie, and someone will write out the script in book form, and I just don't think that has ever worked. So yeah, comments down below. Books that made bad movies, books that made good movies made from terrible movies, books that you don't want to see adapted. Let us know in the comments down below. So please like, subscribe, be my friend on social media, and I will see all of you in my next video. And maybe you'll see him too. Bye, friends.